Well, our thanks as always to Home Street Bank for their support of this podcast. If you're looking for a bank that has it all, great people, great service, great rates, this is the place for you. This is my lender of choice. It should be yours as well. Go to homestreetbank.com. It's your one-stop shop for all your banking needs, both business and personal. That's homestreetbank.com. So how much do our purchase decisions tell us about our own identity? Quite a lot, actually. Let's talk about it today on The Buyer's Mind.
Welcome to The Buyer's Mind, where we take a closer look deep inside your customer's decision-making mechanism to reverse engineer the perfect sales presentation. Now, please welcome your host, Jeff Shore.
Well, welcome everyone once again to The Buyer's Mind. So glad to have you with us on our show where we crawl around inside of our customer's brain and try and figure out how our customers make purchase decisions. Our thought on The Buyer's Mind is that if we understand our customer well enough, then we can reverse engineer our sales presentation to help them to do what they want to do anyway, and that is to buy our product. And today we're going to look at how our purchase decisions help define who we are. I'm joined with our show producer, Paul Murphy. Murph, how is that sitting with you? Does that make you a little nervous right out of the gate?
I don't think I want to be defined by my purchase decisions. I'm not sure. I'd rather be defined, as Martin Luther King Jr. said, by the content of my character.
Right. Okay. So do you deny then, Mr. Murphy, that part of our identity is tied up into our purchase decisions?
I didn't know I was on the witness stand. Okay. Well, yeah. I mean, obviously, it reflects some of who we are by the things that we purchase. So obviously, sure. If I purchase Taco Bell and McDonald's, I'm a fast food kind of a guy, not much of a health nut. It kind of says something about me, doesn't it?
Well, look, it's true that we do tend to deny this or maybe downplay this, but if we're being honest, we really do care about brands. We identify with brands, and just if you just think about your own conversations, there are brands that identify who you are. I, for example, I'm a hockey player. I tend to favor Bauer hockey equipment. Why Bauer? Well, because it's legit, right? And I want to be seen as a legit player. Now, maybe that makes me shallow, but it gives me a brand preference. Or I love my Skagen watch. I have a tendency to lose watches. I tend to take them off when I'm speaking. I use it as a timer, and then I leave it on the podium. So I've actually had to replace that same watch several times. Why Skagen? Because I think it's elegant but understated, and I think there's a part of me that wants to be described exactly that way. The fact is that we are, to some extent, our brands, and our brands they are us. In fact, that leads us to our quote of the day from Scott Cook. He says, "A brand is no longer what we tell the customer it is what customers tell each other it is." And that's very important, because what we tend to do is that we tend to take our brand, we form a relationship with our brand, and then we describe that relationship to other people. Here's why I like this car or that airline. Here's why I prefer this restaurant or that movie or whatever it's going to be. It starts with how we identify ourselves, and then we make up a story that goes along with it. In other words, brands are really cooperative. There is a oneness, a unity between a salesperson and a customer based on the shared view of the brand. So, this last weekend, for example, I was in an Apple store, and the very Apple brand binds me as a customer to the clerk who was helping me. It's almost as if to say we are on the same team, and that's how we would like to think of a good, healthy brand. When I am riding in a Lyft car service, I am connected with the driver through the brand. So those brands have a way of, when we adopt them, of uniting us. Now, the converse is also true. If I really am not happy with a brand, it's my cell phone provider, or it's this a bad restaurant, airline, or whatever it is, then it disconnects us along those lines. And so I want to suggest you here, before we get to our interview, just a quick tip, a sales tip to help you through that. And that is to connect to the brand through personal endorsement that benefits the customer. Connect to the brand through personal endorsement that benefits the customer. So the sentence might start something like this. Let me tell you one thing that I love about this, and the reason I want to show it to you is because I think you'll love it too. So this isn't simply a matter of, let me tell you what I think about this product. It doesn't matter what you think about the product unless you think your customer will appreciate it. So it's okay for you to be able to endorse that, for you to be able to step into that conversation, but it has to be customer-centric. Hey, before we get to our interview, if you are not receiving our Saturday morning free video, well, why not? Just hop over to jeffshore.com and you'll have the opportunity to sign up right there in the front page. And every Saturday morning, we're going to send you a video with a new sales tip, a new mindset technique, something to sort of get your weekend off on the right foot. I've been doing this for years and years. I really enjoy the opportunity to speak into the success of the salespeople that we are so privileged to work with. Just go to jeffshore.com and sign up for our free weekly newsletter. Well, we're joined by Michael Solomon, who literally wrote the book on understanding consumers. His textbooks on consumer behavior, social media marketing, advertising, even fashion psychology and marketing are required readings in hundreds of business schools around the world. He's the professor of marketing in the Hobbs School of Business at St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia. Joining us from the city of brotherly love, Michael Solomon. Michael, how are you today?
Hi, Jeff. I'm just great. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, let's have a little fun. Obviously, with your background, with your field of expertise, it's right in line with the things that we talk about here on The Buyer's Mind. So let's take us back to the start of your journey. What first got you interested in thinking about, I want to know more about the way that customers make purchase decisions, about how advertising and marketing fit into that. Take us back to the genesis of your journey here.
Oh, you mean back when I was raised in a log cabin back in those days? Huh?
Yeah, those days. Yeah.
I actually started to get interested in it when I was a kid. I started to work in a store when I was about 14. I was believe it or not, a wedding consultant. Well, I started in the back room, but I was a tuxedo salesman. And it was my job to measure and fit all these guys who would get dragged in by their fiancés, for a wedding party. And what really intrigued me was that I would notice that, as you can imagine, most of these guys really didn't want to be in the store. They wanted to be anywhere but there. And they were, let's say, they were not the most cooperative customers, but what would happen was, we would pick out their tuxedo and get the right size and all that, lead them to the dressing room. Some cases, the fiance would have to drag them to the dressing room.
Right, of course, yeah. And
when they would emerge from there, I often saw that a magical transformation took place, where now the guy has, stripped off his old jeans or work clothes or whatever. He walks out in a tuxedo with a bow tie and everything that goes with that, and suddenly he's a different person. Suddenly he thinks he's James Bond, and you can practically see him asking for a martini, an extra dry martini or something. And, his the posture would be different. His whole demeanor would be different. And, after witnessing things like that about 500 or 1,000 times, it finally hit me that, there's something going on where the products that this guy is putting on his body are literally changing him as a person, the way he thinks about himself.
Right. And that shouldn't make sense, and yet we find over and over again that's who we are, right? It's what we wear, what we drive. It changes the way we think about ourselves.
Yeah, there's no question about it. And we have these expressions, and I think every culture probably does. But you are what you wear, you are what you drive, and so on. And really, a lot of my research career over 30 years has been based on that observation that brands do, you are what you buy, and you buy what you are. And so, that particular insight that guided me when I did my doctoral dissertation. I did it on the dress for success phenomenon, which was a big deal for listeners who can remember that far back in the 1980s, when the book Dress for Success first came out, it really was an acknowledgement that what you look like does make a difference. And it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. You know, if you look the part, you act the part, and people treat you as if you belong in that part, like actors in a play.
Mm-hmm.
And so we see that it's not just clothing that does that. It's many things. You know, it's jewelry, it's cosmetics, it's interior design, it's automobiles, many consumer-facing categories, even tech products, influence the way we think about ourselves. And so we literally do become what we buy. And that bond, that really strong bond between consumers and brands, is something that I think a lot of managers really aren't aware of, you know, because they assume that people buy things because of what they do. And the reality is that's not true. I believe that we buy things because of what they mean. And in fact, if you look in most product categories, the sad truth is that when if you work in a category, you believe your brand or your store or whatnot is the best thing since sliced bread,
Mm-hmm.
you know. But when you talk to consumers about it, for the most part, they'll say, you know what, they're all pretty much the same.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But there's usually one or two exceptions. There's usually one or two brands in a category that take on really kind of a mystical or cult-like quality. And, you know, you can think of some obvious examples like Apple and Nike and Levi Strauss and so on. And there's a reason for that, because they transcend what the product does, and it becomes something much more tied to who people are, you know. So for example, for a number of years, I did a lot of work for Levi Strauss, and I was able to look at some information that they had, and was, you know, talked quite a bit about how a humble pair of blue jeans really occupies kind of a mysterious or magical place for many people. And that's why even a relatively inexpensive product like a pair of blue jeans can be tremendously important to a person's self-concept.
But one of the issues here that we have to deal with, and fashion is, I think, just a sort of a benchmark for this, because we see fashion trends change on a regular basis, and when you look at consumer behavior, you describe it as a moving target. So how do you know if you are a provider, if you're a marketer, if you're a seller? How do you possibly stay in front of, or even astride to, what those consumer changes are going through?
Yeah, that's the billion-dollar question. You know, there's no magic bullet for that, but there certainly are some easy things you can do that sound obvious, but I'm always surprised how few people do them. You know, one is ask people.
Yeah.
Just and what I often tell both my students and managers is fish where the fish are. In other words, a lot of managers assume that they have really great intuition, you know, and they believe that they have their finger on the pulse of consumers. So they sit in their office and they say, well, this is, you know, I know my customer, this is what they want. And, you know, maybe there are a few people who have that special gift. You know, a lot of people say Steve Jobs, you know, the reason he was so great, such a genius, is that he understood people's needs better than they did. But I think the average person can't rely on that. And so really what you need to do, you know, the Japanese have an expression which is called going to the Gemba, Gemba. And what that means is the Gemba, loosely translated, I don't speak Japanese, but what I've been told it means is that the moment where the action or the experience actually occurs. So in other words, rather than bringing people, let's say, into a laboratory or some other research setting, say a focus group, and asking them about their experiences in life, you need to go to where they are and observe them in action. And so that's one way to do it. And you know, another way is to identify people who are on the kind of the bleeding edge and follow them around. And for a number of years, there were people out there, I haven't seen it too much recently, but people who call themselves cool hunters. And so cool hunting was a special form of marketing research where where these individuals or companies would go out and they would basically walk the streets of really fashion-forward cities like Milan or Tokyo or New York, take a ton of pictures, and basically prepare reports that would update managers on what they're seeing out there on the streets. Now, today we have much more potent weapons at our disposal. We have this internet thing, which I think is probably going to take off.
Yeah, any day now.
It's had mixed results so far, but I think it's going to take off. But seriously, what that allows us to do is to enlist thousands and sometimes even millions of consumers to work for us, because they're our eyes and ears out in the marketplace. And when you look at the amount, especially of visual content that gets uploaded every second, onto YouTube and Instagram and so on, that is an unbelievably valuable and free source of information. And I'm amazed, for example, with Instagram, that more companies don't look very, very seriously at that as really the barometer of what when people post stuff that they're aspiring to, I want to be like this. Well, you should take that seriously. Even if they're not buying it now, that tells you, life is a project. Consumption is a project.
Mm-hmm.
It's a work in process.
Yeah.
And so, to get to your question about how can you be slightly ahead of people, well, it's not by asking them where they are now. It's by asking them where they see themselves going. And if you can map out that trajectory, then you can in fact stay ahead of people.
But so much of where people see they're going, if you ask them the question, they very well may not know, because where they are going might very well depend on where other people are going. So let's do it this way. I'm going to ask you a question, but I'm going to do it in 2 parts. So part A, please define the hive mind.
Okay, the hive mind, that's something I talk about in my book that's coming out shortly. Mm-hmm. What that basically means is that we're seeing a revolutionary change in consumer decision making. The traditional way we've looked at and tried to understand the process of decision making is largely by assuming that an individual, I'm talking about, consumer facing decisions here, not B2B decisions primarily, mm-hmm. That all of our models mostly focus on the individual consumer who's making a decision almost in a vacuum. I mean, we certainly acknowledge that there's peer pressure and that kind of thing. But what we're seeing is that that people are consulting others at a much earlier stage in the process. And so, traditionally you might buy something and then, for example, in the early days of the internet, you might post it online to your friends and say, well, what do you think of this? This is what I just bought. And they'd give you some feedback, Back in the old days, you might, physically show it to people who were your real friends as opposed to your Facebook friends, back when we had real friends. Mm-hmm. But what we're seeing today is that by the time someone, very often, especially younger consumers, by the time they purchase something, it's already been vetted by their peers. So the vetting is occurring before the purchase rather than after. Google calls this the ZMOT, the zero moment of truth, mm-hmm. The point at which the consumer actually makes the decision. And so what's really fascinating is that decision is, in a sense, being delayed. In other words, for example, very often, and my students tell me this all the time, when they go into a store to buy something, they often know exactly what they're buying already. They're not relying on the people in the store to guide them around the shelves and make a decision. They've already researched it. Maybe they've done a price comparison. Maybe they've posted photos and asked their people in their network what they think about it. And so very often the store just becomes the point where it's just more convenient to pick it up as opposed to waiting for UPS to ship it.
But you're suggesting that this is done largely through research, and certainly I see that. I mean, I'm this very morning, a friend of mine posted on Facebook, need some advice, iPhone 8 or iPhone 10. Anyone have any advice or opinions? And there are a couple of dozen, and this was just a couple of hours ago here, but there are a couple of dozen very passionate opinions as to whether one should should buy the 8 or the 10. So there is that active research that's taking place, but there's also a sense of passive research, is there not? There's the idea, where is the tide going? There's a group think aspect of the hive mind.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. And a lot of it is just kind of stream of consciousness. So you might have a specific question, like the example you're giving. But when I talk about the hive mind, what I mean is that it's 24/7 activity. It's buzzing with information about what people are buying, what they're liking, what they're not liking. And so when you're tuning into that, it's kind of like you're plugging into this ongoing stream. Now you have, it's like plugging into a fire hose of information. So you have to filter it in different ways. That's another issue. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely this ongoing tracking of what your friends think is cool or interesting or terrible.
And so it's based on the foundations of social psychology. Just it's safe if other people are doing it as well. Is that your opinion?
Yes, I mean we've always felt more confident when we are conforming to the opinions of others, especially others whose opinions we trust. But now, because we don't have to query them necessarily. In other words, your friend could have easily not asked for that advice, but just plugged into many forums where people already are providing that information. So we're constantly plugging in and out of that. And there is safety in numbers, and the choices are much more crowdsourced than they used to be. Even that term crowdsourcing is relatively new. That's a really important new form of product development that some companies are tuning into. And basically what they're saying is, let's plug into that hive mind, see what our consumers are going to tell us about what they want in a product or service, and then give it to them, which is really, that's the basic marketing concept right there. You don't design a product and then go out and see who can buy it. You work backwards. You figure out what people are saying they need, and then you design it. So the hive mind means that we're always making a collective decision. And, we see this, even with something like food choices in a restaurant. I mean, people, kids these days, if they won't take a bite of food from their plate until they've taken a photo of the plate, posted it on Instagram, and there's even a term for that now. It's called food porn, where people are posting these pictures and basically getting their choices validated, even while they're eating their choices.
Right. You mentioned the young. Let's talk about the young. So much has been said and written about the Millennial Generation. This huge group of people with a lot of money, right? So everybody is out there trying to figure out, how do I appeal to the millennials? When you look at the idea of groupthink, of hive mind, however you want to look at it, are millennials more likely to follow that pattern, or are they more likely to make an independent decision?
Well, I think that they value the illusion of making an independent decision, but their decisions are not as independent as they think they are.
Right. Right.
In other words, they're tapping into this feed and they're using that as input. So they're definitely using brands in a very proactive, constructive way. That is, constructing themselves by creating a collage of brands and that collage may be different from one kid to another. But the brands that they're tapping into tend to be the same ones. In other words, there's kind of a list of favorite brands for millennials and for the Gen Z cohort, which is coming after them, which is even scarier. We know even less about them. But they range from Apple or Nike to Doritos. Doritos and Oreos. Oreos are a very hot brand among Gen Z, and so sometimes it's very mundane brands. Sometimes it's more exotic ones. But that's kind of the raw materials they're using. That's the canvas that they're using to paint a unique picture of themselves. So they do pride themselves on being authentic, and that is probably the most important product attribute that I've seen out there that distinguishes a successful brand from an unsuccessful one. And that is it real? Is it authentic? And, how much can I know about the backstory of that brand?
Are millennials really that different from, say, Gen Xers or baby boomers? Should we, as service providers, as sales professionals, as marketers, should we really be looking at it and saying, I really do need to take a very different approach with the millennials than I do with other generations?
I think you do. I mean, at a very basic level, consumers are consumers, whether they're 60 or 20. But yes, there are, I think, some important differences. For one thing, they're a lot more, ironically, a lot more traditional than baby boomers are. For example, for many of them, their parents are their best friends. And, back in my day, we used to say, never trust anyone over 30. So for example, in retailing, I think one of the big stories today, especially for women's wear and products like that, is that there's a ton of kids out there that love to girls that love to shop with their mothers. And retailers tell me this all the time. I don't think retailers take enough advantage of that by encouraging that activity in some way. But there's an example, I think, of a huge departure where you would never find a Gen X and certainly a baby boomer going out and wanting to be, caught 2,000 feet from their parents. Again, in the old days, they were almost, I don't want to overstate it, but they were almost like enemies. Whereas today they're allies as they're negotiating the marketplace. So that to me is a very significant departure.
What about the idea of the shift in consumer behavior based on an ever-increasing global economy? So many people who are listening right now, they may have been raised in the United States or Canada or wherever they were raised, and yet they're dealing with people who think completely differently, as differently as Western thought is than Eastern thought. How much does that change the way that we have to adapt towards the new consumer approach to the way we do sales and marketing in a cross-cultural environment?
Well, it's incredibly important to be sensitive, obviously, to cultural differences, and many of these are very deep-seated differences that people aren't even aware of. So I'm not talking about the obvious ones like language. Many fun examples of ads that have been translated into other languages and have been a disaster.
Right.
Like the Chevy Nova in Mexico. Nova means doesn't go in Spanish.
Right.
We love those stories. But yes, there are fundamental differences at some level in the worldview that people have, in the myths and rituals and so on that are in their cultures, and it's really important to understand that. Now, but having said that, I'm not sure that many of these people are as different as you might think. It's kind of interesting, when you travel around to other countries, one thing that strikes you, I'm sure you've seen this, is that the kids all tend to look the same. They're all wearing the same brands to some extent. They're wearing the same logos. The Nikes are everywhere. And on and on. And so really what we're seeing is the emergence of what we call a global consumer culture, where what binds people together across cultures is their shared affinity for certain brands. And so the way they can get along, even if they don't speak the same language, is they share the same love of, let's say, Nike. And so that becomes the basis. It's just like people, in the US, when you travel to another part of the country, you can always talk about sports because everybody knows that, most people know the teams and so on. So you have something in common, even if you're meeting a stranger. So in a sense, what we have to look at is not differences by country, but more differences by social class and especially urbanization. So what we tend to find, for example, is that a cosmopolitan consumer, let's say, who lives in Manhattan, has a lot more in common with a cosmopolitan consumer who lives in, say, Lisbon or Beijing than he or she does with someone who lives in upstate New York. So a different way perhaps to look at how we might segment markets is in terms of access to global media, sophistication. There is actually a scale that measures what's called cosmopolitanism, which basically means you're someone who is open to new ideas and likes to experiment with different cultures and so on.
just about out of time. Let's getting really, really practical here. If you're a frontline sales professional, you're going to go out and you're going to talk to somebody today who's thinking about buying an insurance product or a car or jewelry or home or whatever it happens to be. What advice would you give to a salesperson where you're not sure they're doing it right? They're not sure that they're approaching their customers in the right way. Is there any advice that you could offer to say, be thinking about this, change your perspective on that?
Well, I guess, one piece of advice, which is obvious to many of your listeners, but probably worth restating, is that you're there to solve their problem, not your problem. Mm-hmm. And what that means is you need to take their perspective and don't make the assumption that you understand what their problem is. Mm-hmm. So, we can always talk about so-called pain points in every sales interaction where you're trying to identify, what is the thing that is really keeping this person up at night, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And it may not be the thing that you think is keeping them up at night. Yeah. And so rather than just making the assumption that you know it all and that, you're the expert, it's a lot like teaching these days. We no longer have the so-called sage on the stage model, where the professor stands in front of 100 kids and tells them what the world is about, but more what we call the guide on the side, where we try to interact with them and jointly develop a narrative or a perspective that says, let's work together to solve your problem, as opposed to my pushing it down your throat. And so, one of the biggest changes I see in the marketing discipline in the last 10 years is something I talk about a lot, which is that the dichotomy between the producer of a product and the consumer of a product, that those two categories are largely obsolete. Mm-hmm. Because consumers want to participate in the creation of the products that they buy.
Right.
And there's a lot of evidence that when you allow them to do that, as opposed to giving them kind of a preset package, if you allow them to customize or to have some input into what the offering is going to be, their level of loyalty to your company and their level of satisfaction with that product is through the roof.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Awesome. Great stuff. His name is Michael Solomon. You can find him at michaelsolomon.com. We'll put that in the show notes there. Great stuff. You can go on his website, subscribe to his newsletter, buy his book. Great insight. Michael, can't thank you enough. Thanks for being a part of The Buyer's Mind.
Thank you. It was a lot of fun.
Well, so there you have it, Murph, another really smart guy talking about the consumer perspective. And I just thought it was interesting that the whole concept that brands, as he said, brands tell us who we are. There's that strong connections that are formed based on what those brands really mean to us. Did that resonate with you?
Well, and in the statement that he said, we buy things because of what they mean to us. Mm-hmm. And I think that's probably pretty true for most people. Is we relate to something about that brand, whether it's Nike or, for me, I like Sony a lot. I've mentioned that before, just because I think that that's a brand that, again, is quality and is great in the field of electronics where I work.
Yeah. It's funny. We look at the ways that we're going to make a selection, and I think how that brand elicits our emotions and causes us to say, how do I feel about myself, is going to go a long way towards determining whether I should make that purchase in the first place. But there's also the idea of how we gravitate towards what others are thinking. We always feel more confident if we are conforming to the opinions of others. It's interesting, Murph, because on the one hand, I look at it and I go, that's really true. On the other hand, it feels a little shallow. I like to think that I make independent decisions, and yet so much of my time I'm asking myself, what do others think about this decision?
Well, and it goes back to what he talked about with Steve Jobs, and it even goes back before that with Henry Ford. If I'd asked people what they wanted, they would have told me faster horses.
Right.
But, so as a consumer, I often have a hard time trying to put into words what it is that I want. And maybe with a little bit of groupthink, we could come up with a better description than even what Steve Jobs is able to what Steve Jobs was able to do with the iPhone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I thought, too, very interesting about the idea of segmenting by lifestyle rather than by geography, that young person in Manhattan is going to relate a lot more to the young person in Lisbon or Beijing than they will to somebody who's living in upstate New York. And I don't think we don't think that way. All right. We are visual people. We will look and say, how old is this person? That's how I'm going to talk to them. What a nation of origin are they? That's how I'm going to lump them together by sometimes the wrong things. But I think if we looked at it, we said, what is your lifestyle like? It would do us a huge service to them if we segment them by lifestyle. And then finally, just the ideas that Michael brought about not the sage on the stage, but the guide on the side. This is my new favorite saying. That will be a Jeff Shore original by next Thursday, I guarantee you. Now I give Michael credit for that, but that's really, really great. And I just absolutely love it. We're not trying to impress anybody as sales and marketing professionals. We're not trying to make ourselves the star of the show. We are there to try and make it easy for our customer to do what they really want to do anyway. And so I want to just encourage you along those lines to think about it from that perspective. You are there to solve their problem, not your problem. This is something we talk about at Shore Consulting all the time. It's something we talk about at the Buyer's Mind all the time. And I want to encourage you early on in that conversation with a customer, no solving, no selling. No solving, no selling. Early on, it's only about understanding. And when you push yourself into that outside of your comfort zone and into that zone where I really just deeply want to know this customer, it's a game changer, because then that problem really unfolds in its fullness. And when that problem completely unfolds, now you're in a position to be able to come along and say, I got it. I understand. That is when you have the opportunity to do your very best work. So please, early on, just get that mantra in your mind. No solving, no selling. It's about asking, it's about listening, and most importantly, it's about understanding. And if you can do that right, you will customize your sales presentation to the person who's standing in front of you. That's when the magic happens. That is when you change their world. Hey, listen, we would love it if you haven't done so already to subscribe to the podcast. It would really mean a lot to us. If you really love it, a review would mean even more. Just go over to iTunes and you can leave a review. And if you would consider posting a link to the podcast on your social media page, we would really, really appreciate it. Our numbers are growing. We want them to grow even more, but we can't grow them. Only you can grow them. So if you're getting something out of it, let people know. Let people know at your sales meeting. Let your manager know. Get the word out for people to listen to The Buyer's Mind. That's a wrap on today's podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. You can find everything you need at jeffshore.com. But until next time, go out there and change someone's world.